G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. I'll tell you one space that was not safe for dangerous ideas or even for very undangerous jokes. It was Jerry Seinfeld's show in Sydney last night where I had the great fortune to be attending. He's a childhood hero of mine. I first saw Jerry when he was doing his I'm Telling You for the Last Time tour, which was in 1998, 26 years ago. I was fresh out of high school, huge fan of Seinfeld. He was retiring all of the jokes, all of the material that he had accumulated throughout his entire life as he was putting the sitcom to bed. And it was amazing. I mean, seeing him, it's like, it was just seeing one of the greats. The guy's 70 years old, almost 70 years old, and he is so sharp. I mean, he comes running out onto that stage, sprinting, grabs the microphone stand, it drops to the floor, he wrestles the mic off it, his hair is all over the place, he's already sweating, he's so warmed up. People start taking photos of him on their phones, despite the fact that in the foyer, of course, there have been huge signs saying no photography, no videotaping of the performance. And instead of trying to object to it, he's like, come on, do it. Take the videos, take the photos. And everyone pulls out their phones and he proceeds to essentially roast all of us for being phone-addled addicts, and does, this whole routine, which is absolutely hilarious opening material about our relationship to phones, about how things didn't really happen in our lives unless we've captured them on the phones. He said, people say you shouldn't be filming stuff on your phone. You should be there and enjoying your life. What life? He says, what life? Your life is here for the phone. Goes into a whole shtick about how, 8 years later, the phone is going to suggest a photo to you or a video that will remind you of the fact that you are here tonight, which you will have missed because you were photographing it on your phone. Anyway, the first 20 minutes of the show is fantastic. Goes off without a hitch. And then we hear the protesters, just a few rows behind me. A couple of noisy people pull out a Palestinian flag. Jerry stops talking. He goes, oh, here they are. He's like, I hired these people. I hired them. They go on about stop killing Palestinian babies. They tell him that he's worthless because he went to Israel and thereby supported genocide. Anyway, there's some video footage that they took. You can have a look.
Genocide! You're complicit in genocide! Shame on you, Seinfeld!
Shame on you!
40,000 Palestinians dead! 15,000 Palestinian children dead! Shame on you!
15,000 children dead!
You're a hack! You're a hack and a fraud!
From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine!
So that was that, and surprisingly enough, he didn't really do material about it. I mean, there was one joke in response to it, as the audience started booing these people. He said, keep on going, you've almost got them, you're winning them over. But beyond that, he didn't go into any shtick, which I've heard him do on podcasts, so I know he has material about Gaza and about Israel. I was curious as to whether or not he isn't sure exactly where a Sydney crowd is going to land on this. I sort of wondered if maybe he was in New York, he probably would address it more. But being in Sydney and having seen that there were mobs of people waving Palestinian flags just days after October 7th on the footsteps of the Opera House, chanting something about Jews. It was initially reported that they were saying gas the Jews or kill the Jews, and now everyone's like, oh no, they were simply saying where are the Jews? Either way, I don't want a mob of people screaming where are the Jews right after thousands of Jews have been kidnapped and slaughtered. So maybe he just feels like that's one way of not getting the audience on side. But as a result of not really putting a button on that disruption, and of course the two people were escorted out by security within, 90 seconds, 2 minutes, something like that, he never quite regained his stride. The show never soared again after that. I could tell he was a little distracted. Most people wouldn't have, but when you've kind of lost your train of thought, you go down one avenue and then you don't quite follow it up, you don't quite complete the bit, you move on to another bit. He couldn't remember exactly where he'd been. It was not the show that I would like to have seen. Still hilarious. I still love the guy, but they did some damage. And as Jerry said, while they were screaming at him about genocide and about free Palestine from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, he said, I really don't care. This is for these people. These people have paid money to see me. You are disrupting them, not me. And disrupt they did. So is this now the world that we live in, where here in Australia, a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy, it's not really possible to just go and see comedy without the most tepid of gestures towards Israel's right to defend itself on the part of the comedian gets transmuted into some genocidal, homicidal tragedy that needs to be resisted by disrupting everybody else's enjoyment of a night out. I have to say, once again, no one has been a bigger critic of Benjamin Netanyahu than I have. I've called him a corrupt little hack many, many times. I think what's going on in Gaza is a tragedy. I've been consistently opposed to all of the settlement building that Israel has been doing in the West Bank, the persistent lack of a rapprochement, of a roadmap for peace since 2008 when Netanyahu came to power. I agree with the slogan that it is the most un-Jewish thing in the world to make someone a refugee. We have been refugees for thousands of years. It is all we have ever been up until 1948. And it's a moral calamity that there is this population of people who've been forced to live in squalid open-air refugee camps, essentially in perpetuity. And Israel has to shoulder some of the blame for that, especially the current Israeli government that's been in power essentially since 2008. But Zionism is complicated. It doesn't seem complicated to the people who are waving the flags and disrupting Jerry's show. It doesn't even seem complicated to most of the people who I see commenting on it on social media. But setting aside the settlements, the fact that Israel has a military occupation of land that it conquered in 1967 when the Arab states tried to wipe it off the map. Setting that aside, the question of whether or not Jews should have a right to their traditional homeland in some capacity, whether the same sort of gesture that we give towards Indigenous peoples everywhere, which is that they have a connection to the land that predates anyone else's and therefore have some standing to have some say over what happens to that land, that gesture which we make towards Indigenous Australians and Indigenous Americans does not apply to the Indigenous people of the Middle East, is weird, shall we say. I would just want to quote before I go on here from a great piece in the Australian Financial Review by Amy Frydenberg, who is a lawyer. It's entitled "Zionism is about Jewishness, so anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism." And it's a really interesting piece because this is a question that I've wrestled with a lot. When people talk about Zionism, they say we're not being anti-Semitic, we're just questioning Zionism. And indeed, there have been periods of my life where I have been an anti-Zionist, in the sense that I think it's a bit retrograde. It's a bit 19th century to say that one ethnic group should possess a country. It's something that's been done a lot. I mean, Bangladesh was the Muslim bit of South Asia when the British pulled out. There are countless examples of people having some ethnic or religious heritage to a parcel of land and therefore regarding it as theirs. Look at the Saudis. But I still think, probably not a great look. Everywhere should try to be small L liberal, pluralistic, democratic, and support the human rights of all of the people who live in that space. That is something that the original founders of Israel had as a vision. Although it was a Jewish state, you can be an Arab Israeli citizen. There are Arabs in parliament. There are Arabs on the Supreme Court. 20% of the Israeli population in Israel proper itself is Arab. So it is supposed to be a pluralistic place. It's certainly a place that's pluralistic with respect to women's rights and gay rights and so on, in a way that is completely unrecognizable throughout the rest of the Arab world and the Muslim world. Nonetheless, the idea of Zionism does feel a bit old-fashioned. And yet, the way that anti-Zionism is being used at the moment, and the way that free Palestine from the river to the sea is being used as if it were a morally obvious good, is troubling and perplexing. I want to read from Amy Frydenberg's piece in the Financial Review because I found it thought-provoking as someone who does not think that anti-Zionism is necessarily anti-Semitism. But I may now believe that, at least in the way that Frydenberg frames it. She writes, Zionism is the belief in a right to self-determination for the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland, Israel, a land in which the Jewish people have had a continued presence and connection for over 3,000 years. Israel and its capital, Jerusalem, have been at the very heart of the Jewish faith and its history, cited in biblical stories from the rule of King David from about 1000 BC to the destruction of the First Temple and the Second Temple by the Babylonians in 586 BC and then the Romans in 70 AD. The Old Testament is replete with references to Israel starting in the book of Genesis, as is the New Testament, including with the birth of Jesus, a Jew, in Bethlehem. The vast majority of Jewish people in Australia and over the world, writes Amy, identify as Zionists. Israel is central to Jewish customs and obligations, including the shattering of the glass at the conclusion of Jewish wedding ceremonies, which is a reminder of the destruction of the temple, prayers that are recited facing the direction of Jerusalem, and concluding Passover meals with the words, "Next year in Jerusalem," signifying the desire of the Jewish people to be able to return to their homeland in Israel. Once properly understood in this way, writes Amy, Zionism is clearly a characteristic of being Jewish, just like any other religious belief or trait. It has nothing to do with the expansion of geographical borders or the right of any other peoples to own their self-determination, which are separate political arguments with vastly varied opinions among Zionists and non-Zionists alike. Accordingly, she writes, and because she's a lawyer, she's talking about the implications of this for anti-discrimination law and what is legal and illegal to say, what should be considered properly racial vilification, for example. She writes, accordingly, treating someone unfavorably because they're a Zionist is to treat them unfavorably because of an intrinsic element of their Jewishness. And think here to why Jerry Seinfeld is being singled out, for example. Amy goes on to write, it is therefore discrimination and in contravention of state and federal anti-discrimination laws. This is no different to treating a practicing Sikh unfavorably for wearing a turban, treating a Muslim unfavorably for requesting breaks from work to pray, or treating a Catholic unfavorably because they adhere strictly to the teachings of the Catholic Church. Sacking employees for being a member of a Zionist WhatsApp group, Amy writes, or displaying signs at a university that say, Zionists not welcome, are clear examples of unfavorable treatment which would contravene state and federal legislation. However, she writes, expressions of anti-Zionism can manifest in other ways. Explicit threats to destroy the state of Israel or rid it of its Jewish inhabitants, for example, the chant from the river to the sea, she writes, are both anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. In circumstances where half the world's Jewish population currently lives in Israel, to call for the elimination of Israel is to undermine the existence of Jewish people. Further, she writes, when anti-Zionist rhetoric perpetuates hate, intimidation, again, think about what happened last night at Jerry Seinfeld, intimidation, expressions of anti-Zionism that threaten to destroy the state of Israel or at least rid it of its Jewish inhabitants, like the chant from the river to the sea, which they were chanting last night in the theatre. Further, Amy writes, when anti-Zionist rhetoric perpetuates hate, intimidation, and violence towards Jewish people in our community, then it can only be understood as anti-Semitism. Similarly, when it's used to justify the resurfacing of tropes and conspiracy theories about Jewish people, it is clearly anti-Semitic. Think about all the social media posts that you've seen, or if you haven't seen them, you're lucky, that I've seen, that say things like, Zionists love the blood of babies. This is the oldest trope in the book. Amy writes, all this does not mean that someone can't criticize the government of Israel, or its military operations, or call for the end to this conflict and loss of innocent lives both in Gaza and Israel. However, there's a distinction between legitimate criticism of the Israeli government and sloganism that delegitimizes the Jewish people or supports the destruction of Israel. What is it that the protesters were doing last night? Were they criticizing the Israeli government? No. They were sloganeering about the existence of Jewish people in the Middle East. Accordingly, Amy finally writes, while one can legitimately criticize the actions of Israel, its government or defense force, or mourn the tragic loss of innocent lives, it's unacceptable and unlawful to engage in conduct that treats a person differently or unfavorably because of their core Jewish beliefs, including their belief in a homeland, that is, for being a Zionist. Now, I suspect that a lot of people will hear about what happened at Seinfeld's show. And it wasn't just this show, it's been at many, many shows that Seinfeld has been doing. And they'll think, look, these people go too far. It's not right to disrupt a show, but their heart's in the right place. You know, at least they're supporting the dead babies. At least they're supporting an attempt to do something about the worst humanitarian catastrophe of their lives. In fact, one journalist who I follow and who I have a lot of respect for in most other respects in Australia is posting regularly on Instagram these snapshots of text that she's written about Gaza, one of which says, and I quote, "What is unfolding in Gaza, what we are right now bearing witness to, is one of the greatest atrocities in living memory. The killing of innocent people, men, women, children, the elderly, the infirm, the disabled, mothers, fathers, teachers, doctors, journalists, is unequivocally, categorically wrong. There is no other side," she writes. "There is no explanation, no justification, no context, no assurance, no documented history or imagined future, no posturing, no promising, no professing. There is nothing, nothing, nothing," she writes, "that changes this most basic of truths. In this moment, there is only one side." She wrote on Instagram to her many, many followers, "It is, as Naomi Klein tells us in Doppelganger, to side with the child over the gun, no matter whose child, and no matter whose gun. There is something so incontrovertible," she writes, "about siding with a child over a gun, something so blindingly pure." Well, that's an easy way to avoid dealing with the complicated reality of the most intractable geopolitical problem that the world faces, isn't it? I would also note it's actually the same moral chess move that the Israeli far right did after October 7th, where those of us who wanted to understand October 7th in the context of the persecution of Palestinians were told, no, there's no point in looking at context. Just look at all the people who were being raped and slaughtered on October 7th. That's all we need to look at. Don't talk about settlements. Don't talk about a Palestinian homeland. This is just about October 7th. Let's start the clock at midnight on October 6th, and let's just look at the atrocities. Let's ignore what Israel has been doing in Gaza. Let's ignore what Israel has been doing in the West Bank. Let's ignore all the failed peace talks. Let's ignore the missed opportunities of the Netanyahu government. Let's ignore the provocations against Palestinians. Let's ignore the absence of a peace deal, and only look at the atrocities of October 7th. Because morality is very easy when you're looking through a microscope that's pointed up your own arse. It's more complicated when you need to step back and look at the history of the conflict, what both sides want, and where we might go from here. If you were to talk to the protesters who ruined Jerry Seinfeld's show, for me at least, last night, how much do they know about what the Arabs were offered in 1948 and rejected? The Arabs were offered the land that is currently the Palestinian territories, and they didn't want it. They wanted the whole thing. They wanted from the river to the sea. They wanted the Jews in Israel to suffer the same fate as the Jews had in almost every single, not almost, in every single other Arab majority country in the Middle East, where they had been persecuted, killed, pushed out of their homes, driven out of those countries. A mass exodus, a gigantic refugee flow. You know, there's sometimes this misconception that all the Jews in Israel came parachuting in from war-torn Europe in order to resettle a land that none of them had been living on for the past 5,000 years, to pull some kind of poker chip out of their pocket and go, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents times a million greats in the time of King David were here, therefore I get to take your house. There was a bit of that. There was a bit of that more in the 1920s and 1930s as Zionism started to pick up steam. But most of the Israelis who live in Israel, most of the Jews, are indigenous to the Middle East. Most of them have fled from other Arab-majority countries. They are from that neck of the woods. They can trace their lineage back to that neighborhood. Now, of course, there were also Palestinians who were living alongside them, who were driven out, often violently, and those people were supposed to go to a state of their own in the Palestinian territories, which was ostensibly going to be its own country in 1948 until the Arabs, not the Jews, rejected it. I know this seems like such old hat. What on earth does this history have to do with the reality of babies being bombed right now? Unfortunately, it has everything to do with it, because it's relevant to how we assign blame for what's happening, how we assign blame for the tragedy that the Palestinians find themselves in. I regard the Palestinians as essentially hostages. Hostages partly of Israel, and hostages partly of Hamas, hostages of Egypt, which also, we often forget, shares a border with Gaza, a border equally closed as Israel's border. I mean, it's funny. You know, people talk about the blockade on Gaza, the embargo on Gaza, the fact that Gaza, since the Israeli withdrawal in 2005, hasn't truly been free, not a free independent state, because Gazans haven't been able to travel, they haven't been able to go anywhere else, they haven't been able to have stuff come and go freely in and out of their country. I can't imagine why there might be objections to the Gazans having stuff come and go freely when clearly they use them for really constructive things like building lots of tunnels and building lots of rockets and building paragliders with which they can enter their neighboring country and slaughter people and rape people. Can't imagine why there would be such an embargo. But when you ask people about the blockade of Gaza, who is blockading Gaza, the answer is always Israel. No, the answer is Israel and Egypt. And also Hamas, who don't let any Gazans out. Even if you did open the border, Hamas would persecute you or shoot you for leaving. This is a horrible situation where young Palestinians, and I say young because they're not complicit in any of the political failures that have led to their fate, young Palestinians find themselves stuck as hostages in this grand geopolitical game. How much do they know and how much do the protesters last night at Jerry Seinfeld's show know about the offer that was on the table in 1948? Do they know about the Camp David Accords in 1978? Do they know about Oslo in 1993? Do they know about Oslo II in 1995? Do they know about the Camp David process in the year 2000? Do they know about Israel's withdrawal from Gaza in 2005? Well, presumably they know about that because they probably regard that as being a great victory. Do they know about the offer that Ehud Olmert, the Prime Minister of Israel, made to the Palestinians in 2008 that was also rejected, which would give them essentially all of the Palestinian territories back with a few carve-outs that would be offset, carve-outs that is for Israeli settlements in the West Bank that would be offset by giving them land that currently belonged to Israel. Were any of these offers perfect? No. Were they better than the status quo in 2024? Certainly. Surely yes. Surely yes. I mean, this is complicated. What's going on in Palestine is horrendous. But you have a statelet, an enclave, where after the withdrawal of Israel in 2005, there were elections, people voted for Hamas, a jihadist, ISIS-style death cult. That group obviously didn't run any more elections. Why would it? And as a consequence, you've got these poor people imprisoned by Israeli aggression, Egyptian intransigence, the effect of being totally ignored by other Arab states that proclaim loudly how much they care about the Palestinians, but actually treat them with total contempt and disdain, refuse to resettle any of them, refuse to employ them, for example, as labourers in the Gulf states, and instead import hard-working Bangladeshis and Pakistanis in to build their stadiums and to build their airports, not letting any Palestinians leave. You have this total hypocrisy on all sides, where people profess a love of these people, but when it comes to the crunch, do absolutely nothing for them. If you want the Palestinians to ever have a state, then you have to support Palestinian liberals, Palestinian feminists, Palestinian gays, Palestinian pluralists and progressives in sloughing off the yoke of jihadists and ISIS-style Hamas terrorists and somehow having a space in which they can breathe, in which they can pursue some kind of conciliation with not just Israel, but the West, Western civilization, ideas of democracy and equality before the law. You know, you have to get them out of the tyranny of Hamas and ISIS and Hezbollah and Tehran. Now, how do you do that except by prosecuting a war in Gaza? Like people say, well, you're not going to get rid of Hamas. What Israel is doing is unjustified. I mean, you're not going to get rid of the ideology of anti-Semitism. You're not going to get rid of the ideology of anti-Zionism. You're not going to get rid of the ideology that fuels terrorism and fuels Hamas. But you may be able to get rid of the actual individuals who are the senior leadership of Hamas. You may be able to get rid of the actual battalions that threaten Israel. Am I convinced that what Israel is doing is actually necessary militarily? Well, being a military nincompoop, I am not. I have no idea. I think it's quite likely that Netanyahu, that corrupt little hack, as I've said a million times, is clinging on to his political life by trying to prolong a war. It's entirely possible that he is cynically manipulating the war. It's entirely possible that there could have been a less bloodthirsty solution. But at some point, getting rid of Hamas, getting rid of the battalions and the infrastructure and the chain of command of an ISIS-style jihadist group hell-bent on driving all of the Jews out of the Middle East is surely a prerequisite for Palestinian liberation. So those people who disrupted Jerry Seinfeld's show with their facile, fatuous chants about from the river to the sea and about how Jerry is complicit in genocide because he went to the state of Israel, you know, they're really saying that he's complicit in genocide because he's a Jew. The idea that they're on the right side of history and that they have the backs of Palestinian people, this is laughable. The only long-term solution for the Palestinian people is going to be to provide some kind of evidence to the rest of the world that they could run a state the way that, for example, the United Arab Emirates runs a state, and not like some dysfunctional combination of Yemen and Saudi Arabia would run a state. This brings us back to this kind of simplistic moral calculus as evidenced even just on social media all the time. Indeed, in the Instagram post that I was just reading out about how there is only one side when you look at a baby facing a gun. I mean, let's just examine the morality of this for a moment, because I know I'll get into trouble by saying that actually sometimes you should side with the gun over the baby, but allow me a thought experiment. If you have a gun, and let's make it a Jewish baby to make it easier for the quote-unquote anti-Zionists to stomach. Not a pure, blameless Palestinian baby, but one of those nasty little Jew babies, you know. And if I told you that if you kill the Jewish baby, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea forever, and not one more drop of blood will be shed from a single Palestinian or Israeli, and there will be peace in the Middle East for the rest of time, if you didn't kill that baby, you would be a moral monster. I mean, you don't have to be much of a utilitarian to think that the just thing to do would be to kill the baby. And if you don't believe that on the basis of that argument, just raise the stakes. Just say that killing that baby is going to avert a cataclysmic global nuclear war which will annihilate humankind altogether. And not killing the baby is going to lead to total peace, an artificial intelligence revolution that is going to make us all prosperous and happy for the rest of time. Would you still not kill the baby? This is moral, fatuous, simplistic nonsense to say that when faced with a gun and a baby, I will always side with the baby. If you do that, you're an idiot. You're not thinking things through. Now, it may be the case that the killing of these specific Palestinian babies right now, at this point in the war, is completely morally unjustified because there is no larger good to be gained. And if that's the case, I'd probably agree with you. Like, at this point, hasn't Hamas been sufficiently decimated? Can't we grope our way towards a ceasefire? Can't we release all the hostages? Something that you usually don't hear about when people are posting on Instagram about it. You never hear them say, well, we should just release Hamas should just release all the hostages and then it would be much easier to get a settlement. No, but let's just suppose that it may be the case that these babies' deaths are completely unwarranted. That's fine. I'm with you. But that is very different from the simplistic sloganeering and posturing and waving of Palestinian flags and saying any baby's death is never justified. War is sometimes justified. World War II was justified. A lot of babies died. And the idea that this particular war is uniquely barbaric, like the terminology here, what we are now bearing witness to, this journalist is writing on Instagram, giving voice to the majority, I would say the moral center of gravity of Australian public opinion and global public opinion, although global public opinion is probably even more anti-Semitic than this. What we are now bearing witness to, she writes, is one of the greatest atrocities in living memory. In another post, she cites some examples of people who've been killed recently in Gaza. She writes, and I quote, "Today I read a story about a fetus pulled from the womb of its dying mother in Gaza. Great bedtime reading, by the way. If you're scrolling through Instagram, you're like, I like something to look at before I shut eyes. Let's put on the electric blanket and read a story about a fetus being pulled from a womb." She writes, "Perhaps you'd like to know about another baby, a 1-year-old who was rushed in to see a surgeon because his leg had been blown off. The one thing intact was his blood-soaked diaper. Perhaps you'd like to know about the 2 orphaned teenagers," she writes. She goes on to tell their story. "Perhaps you'd like to know about the little boy who had a bad Ramadan because he missed his parents. They had been killed, martyred, as he put it." She writes, "Perhaps you'd like to know about 6-year-old Hind Rajab, who died slowly and alone in a car. Perhaps you'd like to know there's a photo of Sidra Hasuna on the internet wearing a colourful jumper, looking warm and happy, smiling beneath her perfect bangs. Now she's dead as well. Perhaps you'd like to know," she writes, "about Farah Hammam Youssef Bar, or Malik Sami Mohammed Magari, or Asil Amir al-Ashai, or Elena Momen Riyad al-Rifi, or George Sobi, George al-Suri, or Joan Ali Nasser Amer, or Mira Abdelrahman Fatih Radwan, or Tasnim Ramzi Ode Karaman, or Rakan Hossam Hussein Musa, or Etaf Hussein Riyad. Perhaps you'd like to know how old they were." She writes that they were 0 years old, that none of them made it to their first birthday. My tone is not intended to imply that I don't think that each of these deaths is horrendous. Every death is horrendous. And my heart genuinely does go out to the travesty, the catastrophe that's being inflicted on the people of Gaza. My perhaps cynical tone reflects my curiosity about why this journalist knows all those names, and not the names of people being killed in equal or larger numbers in other recent conflicts. We're living in a scenario in which we're receiving our news about the world mediated through algorithms that are tweaked and gamed by powerful forces. We're not sure exactly why things go viral, why they get more engagement or less. We do know that on TikTok, the likelihood of anti-Israeli, pro-Gaza content to be elevated is vastly more than on other social platforms. So something's going on in the Chinese Communist Party's design of the TikTok algorithm that favors that content. I mean, try putting up a video about Tiananmen Square on TikTok and see how well it does. So we know that there's something going on in the background there. We know that Tehran and Hezbollah and ISIS got pretty good at the viral social media game. As I've said before, just remember during the Arab Spring and during the fight against ISIS after that, those viral videos of Daniel Pearl being beheaded, the Wall Street Journal journalist, of captured US fighter pilots being dressed up in Guantanamo Bay-style orange jumpsuits and trapped in cages in the desert and set on fire. This was before virality was even a thing, before we all had supercomputers in our pockets delivering us the latest news videos. But they got to learn how to do this. And Hamas has collaborations with ISIS, and they're funded by the Iranians. So a lot of the quote-unquote citizen journalists who are on the ground documenting these things that are being parroted by well-meaning journalists in Australia and the rest of the West have been generated by people who have an agenda. That doesn't mean that each death isn't tragic. It does mean that we are all a little bit like a cat with a laser pointer, following the thing that's right in front of our face. In 2020, there was a war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And just last year, Azerbaijan took back control of the area that it was fighting for. This was the month before the Hamas attacks. How much did you hear about it in the month before the Hamas attacks? It was a 3-year-long war that put an end to a 30-year standoff over this enclave, and it forced an exodus of ethnic Armenians. An attempted genocide, certainly an ethnic cleansing. Who was standing up for the Armenians? Who was posting the names of the Armenians? Northern Ethiopia has been racked by horrendous violence and fighting in recent years. What are their names? Who gives a shit? I mean, there was the conflict prompted by the Myanmar army's coup in 2021. Not to mention the Russia-Ukraine war. You're talking about 40 to 90,000 Ukrainians dead, 135 to 180,000 Russians killed in the meat grinder of that conflict. Do we have any sympathy for the Russians, for the Russian soldiers? I mean, why not? Look, I hate Putin. I don't think you can roll tanks into a neighboring country. I think he has to lose. I think that's vitally important. But what culpability does a conscripted 18-year-old Russian kid from the far eastern provinces of Russia, who's flown across the country, across 5 time zones or 7 time zones or whatever the hell it is, into the meat grinder of a war, what culpability does he have for Putin's decisions? In some respect, isn't he a bit like the Gazan child? Isn't he a bit like the Gazan teenager who is essentially also a victim of an autocratic, irresponsible, reckless regime? One that's even worse than Putin's government, one that hides its own military assets behind civilians so the civilians will get killed, one that intentionally makes it almost impossible for Israel to clear out Hamas strongholds without killing children so that the videos of those children will appear in the Instagram reels and TikTok videos of the journalists like the one who I'm quoting. Why don't we care about the Russian soldier? You know, in Sudan, 15,000 people are dead. More than 7 million people are being internally displaced in Sudan. That's more people than all the Palestinians who live in all of Palestine. What are their names? What are their names? Why aren't we making the analogy about every one of them when faced with the option of their life versus a soldier's gun? The moral calculus is simple. The reason you don't think the moral calculus is simple is because you've got no fucking idea what's going on in Sudan, and you frankly don't have any fucking idea what's going on in Palestine and Israel either. You've got a morally simplistic, infantile view of the world. You tell me about the name of Sidra Husana. You've seen her photo in a colourful jumper. She looks warm and happy, smiling beneath her perfect bangs. Why did you see that photo? Who posted the photo? Who supplied the photo? The Hamas Information Ministry? Who else would supply it? You talk about the little boy who had a bad Ramadan because he missed his parents because they'd been killed, martyred, as he put it. Well, maybe part of the bloody problem is that we're dealing with a situation where when people's parents are killed, they are regarded as being martyrs. This is kind of the unspoken thing that people feel frustrated about not being able to air publicly. We are not dealing with two equal sides here. Let's just set aside for a moment the question of the tragedy that is being inflicted on the people of Palestine, because I could go on and on about the tragedy that was inflicted on the people of Israel on October 7th. I can quote from the New York Times about how they went and looked at the video footage, the photographs, the GPS data from mobile phones, how they interviewed more than 150 people, including witnesses, local personnel, soldiers, and rape counselors who'd been brought in after October 7th, and how they identified 7 locations where Israeli women and girls were sexually assaulted and mutilated. There are witnesses, multiple witnesses describing in graphic detail how more than 30 bodies of women and girls in and around the rave site and kibbutzim were found by first responders with their legs spread, their clothes torn off, and signs of abuse in their genitals. There was one corpse that the Times reviewed photographs of. She had dozens of nails driven into her thighs and groin. And if you have children listening, turn off for a moment here, because I just want to tell you what we're dealing with. The Times viewed a video showing 2 dead Israelis who appeared to have been shot directly in their vaginas. They interviewed a woman, a 26-year-old accountant, who at 8 a.m. on October 7th was hiding under the low branches of a bushy tree just off Route 232, not far from the rave. She'd been shot in the back, and she covered herself in grass and lay as still as she could. And she says she saw motorcycles, cars, and trucks pulling up. About 100 men got out in military fatigues and combat boots, Hamas soldiers. They handed around assault rifles, grenades, and small missiles, and badly wounded women were being handed around. One guy, she says, grabbed one of the women by the hair and made her bend over while another raped her, and every time she flinched, he plunged a knife into her back. Just remember, a baby versus a gun. Anytime there's a baby versus a gun, it's a very morally simple thing. Just side with the baby. Are we siding with this woman? Are we siding with this woman? I mean, yeah, I guess the most fatuous thing to say is all violence is bad. So after this attack happened, what should have happened? No violence in retaliation? No dismantling of Hamas? Shake hands with Hamas? Like go into business with a jihadist ISIS-style death cult? An anti-pluralistic, anti-women, anti-gay, misogynistic, crazed, theocratic death cult? Is that the solution? Or do you have to drop a few bombs and kill a few babies? While one terrorist, I'm quoting from the New York Times here, this woman said she watched another woman shredded into pieces. That's a direct quote. While one terrorist raped her, another pulled out a box cutter, a Stanley knife, and sliced off her breast. And the other throws her breast to someone else, and they play with it, throw it, and it falls on the road. The men sliced her face, and then the woman fell out of view. Around the same time, this witness said she saw 3 other women raped, and terrorists carrying the severed heads of 3 more women. One of the women who was taken hostage, who wasn't killed, was 9 months pregnant, so something has happened to that baby as well. We don't know what. These people who were doing this on October 7th were the government of Gaza, the democratically elected government of Gaza. Now, of course, the babies who are currently being killed, I should say, in Gaza by Israeli bombs, did not elect those people. But why does Jerry Seinfeld have more responsibility for the fate of that baby than whichever of its parents and uncles and imams and cousins do support Hamas have? Why are they less culpable for the death of the baby, given their general support for a culture and a civilization and a demos that has put in charge the people who pulled off October 7th, than Jerry Seinfeld does? This tricky thing that I'm alluding to that is so frustratingly difficult to talk about because it sounds like some form of white supremacy, when I suppose it is at worst a form of Western civilizational chauvinism, is that there's a difference between the way that different civilizations and different cultures approach life. There are some that are somewhat more dysfunctional, somewhat more conspiracy-addled, somewhat more disempowering to creativity. There are places that spread ideas of grievance and demonization and self-victimhood and complaint. Places that are anti-innovative, that valorize violence and martyrdom, that are religiously oppressive and sexist and anti-Semitic and anti-Western and anti-enlightenment and anti-compromise and anti-democratic and anti-conciliatory, anti-pluralistic, anti-diverse, anti-gay, that are theocratic, that are, in colloquial terms, basket cases. And there are a lot of basket cases across the Middle East. Israel is not a perfect country. Israel has an infuriating, frustratingly right-wing government that has been sinfully intransigent on the issue of what to do about Palestine since 2008. It's not in an easy neck of the woods. Of all the places you could move to in the Middle East, surely Israel would be the one you'd choose. It's the one where gay pride parades take place. It's the one where women enjoy equality. It's the one where IT startups happen. It's the one where Arabs are on the Supreme Court, where Arabs are in Parliament, where Arabs enjoy full citizenship. Doesn't absolve Israel of anything that it's doing. But as I've said before about this sorry conflict, this is more about us than it is about Israel. You know, we are complicit in some historical crimes. We are complicit in the genocide of our First Nations people. We are complicit in colonialism. Indeed, we are complicit in many of the factors in the 20th century that gave rise to Arab dysfunction. Our thirst for oil, our support of the Shah in Iran, our backing of Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. There are lots of ways in which we've intervened that have encouraged dysfunction in the Arab world. But right now, we find ourselves in a situation where you have people standing up in Jerry Seinfeld's show, demonizing him for being a supporter of genocide because he visited the only democracy in the Middle East and stood with some of the people from his own tribe, his own community, his own ethnicity, who had been horrendously traumatized, not just by Hamas, but by a culture of dysfunction, a culture of deep anti-Semitism, a culture of Jew hatred, a culture of insistence that someday there will be a Palestine from the river to the sea, that someday the Jews will be out, the great Satan of America will be vanquished, the little Satan of Israel will be in the dust pail of history, that valorizes martyrdom, I don't want what I'm saying to be in any way misunderstood as being some kind of a justification for the collective punishment of Palestinians, or in any way a way of absolving the Israeli military for the blood that it has on its hands, for the innocent people who've lost their lives in Gaza. But I don't want us, here in Australia, here in the West, to become balkanized into quarrelling, simplistic, morally fatuous, infantile groups of certainty, hunkered down in trenches, committing some kind of performative war of attrition against each other, where whoever can shout loudest and disrupt the largest number of comedy shows wins. This shit's complicated. I wish I'd got to enjoy an uncomplicated night of comedy with Jerry Seinfeld last night. God bless. I'll see you next week.